December 7, 1941. Youngstown, Ohio. Snow settled on the rusted girders of the Republic Steel Mill as a cold wind pushed smoke low across the ground. Far beneath the pounding furnaces and screaming rollers, hidden below layers of reinforced concrete, one man stood alone under surgical light. His name was Nathaniel Crow. And at that exact moment, while sirens began to wail across the nation for Pearl Harbor, he placed his hand on a slab of cooling steel that should not have existed. If stories like this pull you into the hidden side of history, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and tell us in the comments where you are watching from around the world. What happens next in this underground lab would quietly reshape naval warfare. Crow had been given no room for failure. His assignment was simple in words and impossible in execution. Create armor that no enemy shell could defeat. The Navy already feared the future that radar and espionage were beginning to reveal. German armor-piercing science was advancing at frightening speed. Japanese naval gunnery tests were breaking every known scale of ballistic prediction. The oceans were about to become killing grounds of steel and fire. And at the center of that coming storm stood the Navy's newest giants, the Iowa-class battleships. Faster than any capital ship ever built. Armed with guns that could strike targets beyond the horizon. Yet speed and firepower meant nothing if the armor failed. Crow had not been selected for reputation. He had been selected for discretion. He kept no family photographs, wrote no personal letters, left no traceable career path. To the Navy, he was an instrument. To history, he would become a ghost. For 6 months beneath the mill, he tested variation after variation. Nickel alloys, chromium blends, exotic trace combinations borrowed from turbine metallurgy and experimental aviation armor. Each plate failed in familiar ways, cracking, spalling, shattering under extreme stress. Until the mistake. On that morning in December, a supply clerk had misfiled a trace element drum intended for industrial blades. The contamination invalidated weeks of work. Crow nearly ordered the entire crucible dumped. But something in the fracture pattern of a discarded sample stopped him. He ordered the ingots cooled, cut, pressed. The steel behaved oddly even under ordinary pressure. Under extreme load, it did something no known armor ever had. It folded, not fractured, not shattered. It absorbed impact inward, dispersing energy across its internal structure like living tissue under force. When Crow ordered ballistic testing, armor-piercing rounds collapsed on the surface like soft metal striking stone. The plate beneath them remained whole. Within 48 hours, Naval Intelligence sealed the facility. The alloy received a sterile designation that revealed nothing and concealed everything. Reinforced Variant X. The formula was fragmented and distributed across separate classified vaults, so that no single breach could expose the full truth. Even Crow was no longer granted full access to his own design. Convoys departed under blackout. Variant X was rushed east toward Atlantic shipyards where massive hulls waited in skeletal silence. Among them was the USS Iowa. Its armor belt was quietly altered, its internal strike zones redesigned. No shipyard chief was told why thickness ratios suddenly changed. They obeyed because war left no time for explanation. Then the laboratory burned. Shortly after midnight, an inferno tore through the underground levels with temperatures hot enough to melt industrial-grade steel. Crow escaped through a secondary shaft moments before the main chamber collapsed. When recovery crews forced entry days later, they found one junior technician dead near the press controls. Entire cabinets of test data were gone. Not destroyed. Removed. The official report blamed electrical failure. Crow knew the fire had been deliberate, because the one cabinet that mattered most had been unbolted cleanly from the concrete. Someone had entered before the flames and taken what they wanted. Yet the program did not stop. The Navy needed the armor more than it needed certainty. Production continued under deeper secrecy. Crow was transferred to a new site under a new designation. His movements were limited. His communications filtered. He no longer worked alone. The eyes that watched him never blinked. and still the metal moved forward into the fleet. By mid-1942, the Navy ordered the first full-scale test under live combat conditions. A decommissioned cruiser was fitted with Variant X at critical impact zones and towed far beyond commercial shipping lanes. Only a handful of officers were present. A full-power armor-piercing shell was chambered. Distance was set at near point-blank by naval standards. No allowances were made for mercy. The gun fired. The shell struck. It did not penetrate. It did not ricochet. It collapsed. The armor beneath bore only a scorched imprint where energy had been swallowed whole. For the first time in naval history, a battleship-grade gun had been neutralized by armor alone. Officers stared in silence. Some crossed themselves. Some whispered that what they had just witnessed belonged to the realm of science fiction. Crow did not speak. Under magnification, he saw what terrified him. The alloy had changed under fire. Its internal grain structure had shifted permanently. The metal now carried the memory of impact. It had not failed. It had transformed. Crow documented the anomaly in a sealed warning report and marked it with the highest danger classification available. He understood something the Navy did not yet want to acknowledge. Strength and stability were not the same thing. By late 1943, the Iowa-class battleships entered active service. Their crews trusted the steel without question. They admired the speed, the thunder of the guns, the sense of invincibility that settled into the bones of men who stood on self-proclaimed unsinkable decks. Crow watched every deployment from silence. The war demanded results, not uncertainties. And somewhere across the rolling black of the Pacific, Variant X was about to face the only test that ultimately mattered. November 19, 1943. Central Pacific Ocean. Steel decks shuddered as the USS Iowa cut through black water at flank speed. The ocean rolled beneath her hull like a living creature in the dark. Above, clouds dragged low across the sky, heavy with rain. Radar contacts blinked and vanished. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft were searching for high-value targets. The Iowa was now one of the most heavily armored ships ever to sail into a live war zone. And no one aboard her knew what truly lived inside her steel. Nathaniel Crow followed the deployment from a sealed operations room thousands of miles away. Reports came through redacted channels. Speed trials, gunnery exercises, near misses from long-range torpedoes. Everything the Iowa survived without a breach deepened Crow's unease rather than easing it. Each impact rewrote the internal structure of Variant X. Each shock pressed the alloy further along an irreversible path. In the early months of 1944, American naval intelligence began receiving a new class of warnings. Japanese gunners were adjusting shell composition. Delays in fuse detonation. Heavier penetrator caps. Changes designed specifically to defeat modern armor belts. The enemy had learned. Adaptation had begun. The first real engagement came without warning. January 29, 1944. Marshall Islands Campaign. A Japanese shore battery hidden beneath jungle canopy opened fire on an approaching task force. Shells climbed into the sky like slow-burning stars and fell screaming toward the American formation. One round struck low on the Iowa's armor belt at an oblique angle. Observers aboard neighboring ships braced for catastrophic breach. The impact sounded different from anything they had ever heard. A dull, swallowed concussion. No rupture. No internal explosion. Only a brief shudder beneath the deck plates. If this moment alone tells you how close history came to turning, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends now and tell us where you're watching from around the world. Some turning points only reveal themselves decades later. Below deck, inspection teams found the plate intact. But microscopic analysis later revealed something new. Internal lattice distortion. Subsurface compression lines forming in organized, repeating patterns. The metal was changing again. Crow marked another warning in his classified log. No response came back. The tempo of war increased. Island after island fell under American firepower. Carrier groups pushed deeper into Japanese-held waters. Battleships became mobile fortresses of bombardment. The Iowa's guns pulverized shore installations from distances once thought impossible. With every shock wave that traveled through her frame, Variant X absorbed and rearranged itself again. Crow began to fear that the alloy was no longer merely defensive. He had never intended to create something adaptive. He had tried to create something resilient. The distinction mattered more than anyone yet understood. March 19, 1944. Philippine Sea approaches. Japanese aircraft broke through outer fighter screens in a desperate low-altitude strike. Dive bombers screamed downward under anti-aircraft fire that turned the sky into a corridor of burning tracer lines. One aircraft released its bomb too late. The weapon impacted the Iowa squarely amidships before detonating. The explosion rocked the ship. Fire rolled across the deck. Men were thrown to the steel, but the hull beneath the blast remained sealed. No breach. No flooding. If you are watching this unfold right now, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and write your location in the comments. Moments like this shaped the fate of thousands who never knew why they lived. Crow's fear deepened. The alloy had now absorbed concussive heat and armor-piercing impact, two forms of extreme energy in rapid succession. And the metal had not rejected either. It had incorporated them. By mid-1944, Crow's communications grew shorter. His warning memos went unanswered. The Navy no longer wanted to hear about long-term instability. The fleet was winning. The armor was performing. That was all that mattered. Until the Pacific changed. October 24, 1944. The Battle of Leyte Gulf. The largest naval confrontation in history erupted across hundreds of miles of ocean. Battleships, carriers, cruisers, and destroyers converged in overlapping fields of fire. Radar screens overflowed with contacts. Orders overlapped. Confusion turned the sea into a chaos of converging steel. The Iowa was ordered at full speed toward a formation believed to include Japanese capital ships. She would never engage at close range that day. But danger still found her. A Japanese aircraft surfaced through cloud cover directly over the formation and released a late detonating armor-piercing bomb from extreme altitude. The weapon fell nearly vertically, accelerating beyond its intended design envelope. It struck the Iowa's forward deck at near-terminal velocity. Observers across the formation expected to witness a catastrophic magazine detonation. The impact detonated seconds later. The deck suffered massive surface damage. Fires broke out. Anti-aircraft guns fell silent for several terrifying moments as smoke swallowed the forward superstructure. Then the signal lamps lit again. The Iowa remained afloat. Her internal compartments were unbreached. If this strike does not make you question what truly protected that ship, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and comment where you're watching from. Because what happened inside that armor would never be fully documented. Later inspections revealed something unprecedented. Variant X had redistributed stress across multiple internal planes. Where normal armor would have passed energy inward until it fractured, this alloy diffused the force in layered waves. The metal had become a shock manager rather than a pure barrier. Crow stared at the returned data until his eyes blurred. The metal was no longer a passive shield. It was an active system, and active systems could evolve. The Navy pushed forward. Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each operation placed American ships under increasing bombardment. Kamikaze attacks turned the sky itself into a weapon. The Iowa survived multiple close calls. Every survival taught the enemy that the ship could not be easily killed. And every survival taught the metal something new about the nature of war. By early 1945, Crow stopped sleeping. He began seeing patterns in his data that no one else was allowed to view. Stress memory stacking in geometric progression. Energy absorption increasing beyond original theoretical ceilings. The alloy was no longer behaving solely as engineered matter. It was beginning to behave statistically. Nathaniel Crow requested an emergency review. It was denied. The Navy needed victory, not hesitation. The Pacific Campaign was approaching its conclusion. The armor had never failed. That was the only metric that mattered. April 1st, 1945. Okinawa. Shore batteries engaged American ships from concealed positions. The Iowa absorbed multiple glancing hits across her armor belt over several hours of sustained fire support. Each round that struck rewrote the metal again. If you are still with us at this point in the story, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and tell us your country in the comments. This is the moment when the line between protection and something far more dangerous began to blur. After Okinawa, Crow's warnings finally changed tone. He no longer wrote about instability in the future. He began writing about inevitability. He did not fear that Variant X would fail under stress. He feared that it would continue to adapt beyond the boundaries of its original constraints. That under enough cumulative exposure, it would no longer behave as armor at all. He prepared a sealed dossier for naval intelligence detailing a theoretical failure mode that had never existed in any metal before. A condition where stored structural energy could no longer be evenly dissipated. A scenario in which the armor itself could become a reservoir of destructive force. 2 weeks after submitting that file, Crow was ordered to prepare for permanent transfer. No location was specified. May 14, 1945. The final major naval operations in the Pacific were winding down. Japanese resistance was collapsing into scattered pockets of desperation. The Iowa remained afloat, unbreached, undisputed as the most heavily protected battleship ever deployed. If this is your first time hearing about the hidden science inside these ships, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends now and comment where you're listening from. Because the most dangerous phase of this story had not yet occurred in combat. The war ended 3 months later. Japan surrendered. The oceans began to quiet. The battleships returned home amid celebration. Bands played. Families waited at the docks. The Iowa was hailed as a symbol of American naval supremacy. Her armor became legend. Her survival statistics circulated through classified briefings and whispered technical circles. Nathaniel Crow was never seen on any dock. His transfer order remained sealed. His name vanished from active rosters. His clearance records were frozen at their final timestamp. Years later, his laboratory files would surface in fragmented redactions that contradicted themselves. Some described Variant X as the greatest defensive leap in naval history. Others described it as an uncontrolled experiment never meant to leave the test chamber. And somewhere inside the steel of the Iowa, the accumulated memory of every impact remained locked in silence. Waiting. September 2nd, 1945. Tokyo Bay. The water lay unnaturally calm beneath a sky scrubbed clean by late summer wind. Battleships, carriers, and cruisers formed a slow-moving constellation of steel across the bay. At the center of the formation, the USS Iowa held position as representatives of two worlds prepared to sign the document that would end a global war. Her guns were silent. Her decks were lined with sailors in dress whites. To the eye, she looked unchanged. To the metal within her skin, the war had never truly ended. Deep inside her armor structure, Variant X still carried the compressed memory of every shell, bomb, and shockwave it had absorbed across two oceans. The alloy had been born from a mistake. It had matured under fire. Nathaniel Crow was not present for the surrender. In fact, he had not been officially present anywhere for months. After his sealed transfer order was issued in May of 1945, Crow was moved without public record. No new laboratory appeared under his name. No payroll authorization surfaced. His clearance status froze at a classification level that technically no longer existed under peacetime reorganization. Even the men tasked with escorting him were later unable to reconcile the routing on their own orders. Each segment of the transfer resolved into dead paper. Crow disappeared into his own paperwork. Behind closed doors, the Navy began its post-war accounting. Combat performance was analyzed. Damage models were reconstructed. Survival probabilities were recalculated with peacetime precision. Again and again, one conclusion emerged unchanged. The Iowa-class battleships had absorbed levels of punishment that exceeded every prior theoretical limit for capital ship survivability. In more than one instance, the fleet should have lost a battleship outright. It never did. Yet within the internal metallurgical reviews, something unsettling emerged. Sections of recovered Variant X, removed during refits, did not behave like ordinary armor. Under stress testing, some samples exhibited increasing resistance after repeated impacts rather than fatigue. Others demonstrated unpredictable redistribution of force across previously stable structural planes. In a few isolated cases, microfractures appeared not from incoming force, but from within the metal itself after accumulated testing. The reports did not use words like unstable. They used words like nonlinear. The Navy quietly classified the findings under a new umbrella of restricted research. Variant X would not be used again in future ship classes. Officially, advances in missile warfare and naval aviation had rendered battleship-level armor obsolete. Unofficially, the metal itself had become too complex to fully control. Years passed. The Iowa returned to peacetime duty. Training cruises, fleet reviews, port visits where crowds gathered along the shoreline to see the ship that had never been breached. Her armor became legend among sailors. Among engineers, it became an academic ghost. In 1950, during the Korean War, the Iowa returned to active combat operations. Once again, shells struck her hull. Once again, bombs fell near her decks. Once again, Variant X absorbed the violence without rupture. Each new engagement added to the silent archive embedded in her skin. Back in classified research facilities, metallurgists who had never met Crow attempted to replicate isolated fragments of his work. None succeeded. Some theorized that Crow's original contamination event had introduced a statistical anomaly that could not be reproduced under controlled conditions. Others feared that the alloy required chaotic input to assume its unique properties: impact, heat, stress, variability, war. In controlled laboratories, Variant X reverted toward ordinary high-tensile steel. In combat, it evolved. By the 1960s, the first of the Iowa-class ships began to cycle into reserve. Their armor remained intact, their internal structure still unreadable. The alloy was left in place because no practical method existed to safely remove it in full. In 1983, when the Iowa class was reactivated for Cold War service, modern engineers were granted access to internal armor zones previously sealed since World War II. What they found contradicted foundational assumptions of post-war metallurgy. The alloy layers exhibited energy-compounded deformation patterns that should have been impossible for passive armor. Stress corridors ran through the metal like fossilized lightning. The plates had not weakened with age. In some zones, they had grown measurably stronger. The engineers classified their findings. At that same time, archival efforts intensified around forgotten wartime research programs. Fragmented references to reinforced Variant X resurfaced under different codenames across multiple declassified document sets. Most of those records were incomplete. Sections were missing. Dates contradicted one another. Only one constant remained. Nathaniel Crow's signature appeared on several early approval forms. Then it stopped appearing altogether. No death certificate was ever located. No pension allocation was issued. No reclassification note was found. For all practical purposes, Crow ceased to exist at the exact moment his final theoretical warning entered naval intelligence custody. That warning, discovered decades later in a restricted archive, contained no equations. It contained language. Crow had described Variant X not as a finished invention, but as a system entering an emergent phase. He warned that under sufficient accumulative exposure to extreme energy, the alloy's internal structure could eventually reach a threshold where energy dissipation would transition into energy retention. In that state, the metal would no longer behave as a shield. It would behave as a reservoir, He concluded the document with a final sentence. The armor will not fail the ship. The question is what the ship may one day fail to contain. The Navy sealed the warning. Time carried on. In 1989, an explosion tore through Turret 2 of the Iowa during a training exercise, killing 47 sailors. The official investigation blamed procedural error and unstable propellant. Yet some of the test data recovered from the blast's interaction with internal armor plates exhibited anomalies that could not be fully reconciled with known explosive dynamics. Once again, the discussion was buried beneath classification layers. Once again, Variant X remained in place. By the 1990s, the Iowa-class battleships were finally retired from active service. One by one, they became museum ships. Visitors walked their decks. Children placed their hands against the same steel that had once faced the full weight of enemy fire. No placard mentioned Variant X. No exhibit explained what truly lay beneath the paint and rivets. The legend of invincible armor lived on. The man who created it remained absent from every official narrative. Decades later, a private researcher quietly assembled redacted fragments from multiple declassification cycles. When laid side by side, the documents revealed a pattern that had never been acknowledged as a whole. Variant X was not simply stronger than standard naval armor. It was different in kind. It formed energy absorption networks that were not static. They were cumulative. Each shock altered the next. Each impact reshaped the metal's response to the future. The implications were profound. If Crow's final warning had been accurate, the armor inside the Iowa had not merely survived the war. It had learned from it. To this day, the full formula of reinforced Variant X has never been publicly disclosed. Whether it was lost with Crow, deliberately erased, or permanently classified remains unknown. The Navy continues to deny that the alloy represented anything beyond an incremental metallurgical improvement. Yet the survival data tells a different story. So do the unexplained microstructural behaviors committed to classified addenda. The Iowa rests now as a museum ship. Her hull is quiet. Her guns are silent. Her armor remains sealed beneath layers of paint and corrosion control. Visitors often press their palms against her steel and feel only cold metal beneath their fingers. They do not feel the compressed history locked inside. They do not feel the stress pathways that still sleep within that alloy. And they will never know how close a forgotten metallurgist came to creating a material the world was not prepared to understand. Because Nathaniel Crow never published his work. He never testified before a committee. He never received medal. He vanished into the wake of his own invention. Some historians believe he was reassigned. Some believe he was silenced. Some believe he simply continued his work under a new name in a deeper laboratory that never appeared on any map. And some believe that his final warning came too late for even the Navy to fully contain what Variant X had become. The Iowa survived every war she sailed into. The metal within her survived every attempt to categorize it. And to this day, in the quiet spaces between museum footfalls and shoreline wind, the most advanced armor ever forged still holds the memory of war inside its skin. If stories like this remind you that the greatest forces in history often move unseen, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and tell us in the comments where you are watching from around the world. Some legends are written in steel. Others are written in silence.